Well, we've invited water expert Professor Anthony Turton to the studio to help clarify some of the issues highlighted in that insert. Prof Turton has worked extensively in Limpopo, both with big business and communities involved with resource extraction in that area. Prof, thank you very much for joining us.
Always a pleasure to be here.
We saw the director of Labonte 5 there arguing that his removal of the sand from that river actually increases the access to water for many of the farmers in that area. What do you have to say to that?
Well, the spirit of the National Water Act is being challenged there, because the National Water Act makes the water in the aquatic ecosystem protected by right. It's the only water, along with basic human needs, that's protected by right. So that experiment that was done is an absolutely pseudo-scientific experiment. It has absolutely no scientific validity whatsoever. If anything, what it shows is that the river holds back water to sustain the aquatic ecosystem. And that's really the important point in the story. The Limpopo River Basin has got a very specific hydrology, and we need to understand that. The Limpopo River Basin is characterized by the fact that of 100 units of rain that fall out of the sky, only 5 units of water end up in the river. The other 94 units get lost to evaporation, and only 1 unit penetrates into the ground for deep groundwater. So that's the kind of rough water balance, hydrological balance at the river basin level. So while you're digging a hole in the alluvial aquifer, what happens is it causes the water to actually flow to that hole, creating the impression that there is an abundant resource in that localized area, but the overall water balance is being affected. So ultimately what will happen, in my view, is that if you continue to do this, you will get an over-abstraction in that immediate area of sand mining. But then if you look further downstream where that river joins up with the Limpopo, it almost looks like an alluvial delta, something like the Nile River Delta, and you see a lot of center pivot farmers there. Now those farmers are mining water in a way from the same aquifer system. If you take out upstream, ultimately those downstream farmers are going to be affected. So in a nutshell, the water that's retained by the sand is not wasted. The water that's retained by the sand is there to sustain the aquatic ecosystem, which in that particular context happens to go through long periods of time of drought. So in effect, that river system is almost like a linear oasis in a desert. That's actually on the edge of the Kalahari desert, or the edge of the Kalahari system, and under conditions of climate change, as far as we can ascertain at this moment in time, that Kalahari is likely to expand over time. So what we need to do is protect that aquatic ecosystem, that linear oasis in the desert, if you like. We have to protect it, and you see they mention these big flood pulses that come through. Such systems are characterized by flood pulses. And you saw the line outside the town that shows how high the flood is. That is entirely a natural event, and that cleans the system out. So in a nutshell, a system like that is very variable. It is dynamically stable, if you like, and it is driven by long time scales, but most specifically by flood pulses. And the very important thing is that the alluvial aquifer forms a linear oasis in the desert. If you take that system out as a functioning ecosystem, you then start having knock-on effects, because in effect you go over ecological thresholds.
Now, of course, sand in a river is to an extent a renewable resource, in that you have these flood pulses which often clear rivers out and then they silt up again over time. How long would it take that river to rehabilitate itself after it's been mined?
Look, it's yes and no. The sand is the result of many, many years of erosion. In fact, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years worth of erosion. So you are now mining mechanically, and you're taking out a relatively large volume in a very localized area in a very short space of time. What that's going to start doing now is going to start introducing a new kind of instability within the system, because the next flood that comes through will have an increased velocity to it, so it will erode somewhere else. And in effect, what is happening is that the miner is kind of stealing the sand from someone else's mine without actually going there and physically stealing it. Nature is bringing it and dumping it in the hole that he's making.
I have a degree of sympathy, I suppose, with these small miners, in that they have neither the corporate governance or the environmental know-how to often act in a responsible way. But they sell on to large companies that have both of those things. Yes. Is there a responsibility with a listed company like Afrimat to be having a look at where they get their resources from?
Well, certainly if you look at the modern trends in terms of ecological management, environmental management on publicly listed companies in particular, the ISO 14000, for example, makes it incumbent upon the the managers of a company, if you like, to actually make sure that the entire supply chain is legally compliant. That river, the dry sandy river, is in effect a wetland. So when you're mining in a wetland, there's a whole raft of legislation that comes into play. So I'm not sure that the full supply chain management is being dealt with properly. And I know for a fact that Eskom tries to be a responsible company. I mean, they really are, go out of their way to be responsible. And part of their responsibility is to ensure that their supply chain management is fully legally compliant.
So in a nutshell, what are we getting from this?
Well, in any case like this, you're always going to have a benefit. Someone will benefit from that operation, and someone's going to pay. So ultimately, it comes down to a balancing between the costs and the benefits, and more importantly, at what level of scale. Are you going to benefit at a localized level, or are you going to benefit at a regional or national? In this context, Medupi is of national strategic importance. So you have to balance out all those different costs and benefits at different levels of scale to ultimately make sure that we're doing this in the broader interest of society.
Thanks very much, Prof. It certainly raises a very interesting question. Should large companies be held responsible for their entire supply chain, where their resources come from? Let us know your thoughts on our Facebook page, 50/50 Community.